It was the end of April 2008. Hong Kong's wet markets were buzzing with their usual rhythm, loud voices, the clanging of cleavers, and the sharp scent of raw meat hanging in the humid air. Somewhere among the pork slabs and bones, a local woman paused, her eyes drawn to a pile of oddly cut bones in a butcher's display. She didn't think much of it, just another cut, another deal. But she wasn't the only one who'd seen it. Behind the counter, blood-stained hands rearranged the pile as if to hide something. Something human. At the time, no one suspected a thing. Until 2 days later, when a middle-aged woman, a waste collector from the outskirts of the city, walked into a police station. Her 16-year-old daughter, Jia Mei, had disappeared. She had left on April 27th to meet someone and never came back. Jia Mei wasn't your average teenager. She was bright, ambitious, top of her class, and as police would soon find out, she was also leading a dangerous double life. By day, a student. By night, an online escort advertising herself under the name Kimi. The authorities initially brushed it off. Teenage girls ran away all the time, they said, but her mother knew something wasn't right. Jia Mei always came home. Always. As police began to dig into her last known contacts, what they found would unravel one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern Hong Kong history. Because what started as a missing persons report was about to uncover something far more horrific. A market full of meat, a girl who vanished, and a killer who didn't think anyone would notice. But someone did. And here's the question. How does a girl disappear and end up inside a butcher shop? April 27, 2008, a Sunday like any other in the working-class neighborhood of Tai Po, Hong Kong. That morning, 16-year-old Jia Mei told her mother she was stepping out for a short meeting. Just a quick job, she said, leaving her mother with a tired smile and a small wave. She never came back. 2 days later, her mother, a woman in her early 50s who collected recyclables for a living, showed up at the local police station. Her daughter wasn't answering calls, hadn't messaged back, and hadn't been seen by anyone in the neighborhood. At first, officers took the report but didn't rush to act. Teenagers disappear. Maybe she was angry. Maybe she just needed space. But her mother knew better. Jia Mei wasn't like that. Eventually, the case was pushed forward, and police began combing through missing person databases. No match. No recent accidents or reports. So they turned to the media. A missing poster went out, and Jia Mei's face, young, pretty, with dark eyes and shoulder-length hair, appeared on Hong Kong's evening broadcasts. And that's when the layers began to peel back. On paper, Jia Mei seemed like a model student, top of her class, perfect attendance, accolades in regional writing competitions. But police found that underneath her clean image was something far more complex. Months before her disappearance, Jia Mei had begun posting suggestive photos online using the alias Kimi. It wasn't just for attention. She was charging for private meetups. Clients paid between 1,500 to 2,600 yuan for a night. It's believed she met with at least 10 individuals in the months leading up to her disappearance. The motivation, money, and lots of it. Social media posts revealed Jia Mei was in debt, allegedly owing over 50,000 yuan. Her sister Ah Bing would later recall that despite making good money, Jia Mei never brought any of it home. They had assumed she was simply saving. They were wrong. She wasn't proud of it. In one final online status posted just days before her disappearance, Jia Mei mentioned a man who had refused to pay after their arrangement, a cryptic, ominous note that now haunts investigators. Police turned to her online records, phone logs, chat history. Among the dozens of contacts was one name that appeared more often than the rest, Bin Liu. A construction worker from mainland China, 10 years older than Jia Mei, who reportedly had developed a deep affection for her, one that, according to messages, she did not return. She called him a low-paid laborer, too rural, not my type, but Liu kept messaging, offering to pay double, even triple, just to spend time with her. According to his own testimony, he just wanted to be around her, even if she was with other men. Police interviewed Liu. His alibi was solid, airtight even. Surveillance footage confirmed he was at his apartment that night, and neighbors vouched for his presence. So for a while the case hit a wall. Investigators were flooded with phone tips, online rumors, and sightings, all leading nowhere. That's when the call came in. On May 2nd, a man named Jia Mei contacted police. His voice shook. He told officers his friend, someone named Kai Tai, had phoned him in the middle of the night with a terrifying confession. He said, he killed a girl. He said he skinned her, chopped her up. D hadn't taken it seriously at the time, thought it was a sick joke. He was half asleep when the call came in, but a few days later, while watching the missing persons segment on TV, he saw the photo of Jia Mei. His heart dropped. The girl in the photo looked exactly like the one Kai Tai had described. Police immediately cross-referenced Jia Mei's phone records, and there it was, a series of messages and call logs connecting her to Kai Tai. One of her final online transactions had been with him.
They weren't dealing with a runaway anymore. They were dealing with something darker.
Behind the smiling face of a teenage girl chasing her dreams was a twisted trap, and somewhere in the alleys of Hong Kong, someone already knew what had happened to her, and soon so would the rest of the world. At first, no one believed it. When Yandi stumbled into the police station on May 2nd, sleep-deprived and rattled, officers barely knew what to make of him. He looked shaken, his words disjointed, like someone trying to piece together a dream or a nightmare. He told them that a friend of his, Kai Tai, had called him out of the blue one night. The tone was strange, rambling, almost intoxicated, but it was what Kai Tai said that stopped him cold.
He told me he had killed a girl. Yande whispered. He said he skinned her. He said he cut her up.
At first he thought it was nonsense, maybe a sick joke or the delusions of a man high out of his mind. But after seeing the TV report about a missing girl, everything snapped into place. The details Kai Tai had shared, the description, the timing, the words, all lined up. Suddenly, what had sounded like a hallucinated story sounded like a confession. Detectives moved fast. They pulled the missing persons file for Jia Mei and reviewed her last known digital activity. Among her messaging history was a user under the alias Tai K, tied to an IP address now traced back to a small toy shop in Sham Shui Po. The shop was owned by none other than Kai Tai.
That name wasn't unfamiliar to law enforcement. He had been on their radar before, a known seller of counterfeit goods and smuggled cigarettes, and someone with a lengthy juvenile record for violence. But what concerned police most now wasn't his past, it was what they might find in his present.
A surveillance unit was dispatched to monitor his apartment in the old Genfa building. Officers watched as he moved in and out erratically, never staying still, always looking over his shoulder. Enough probable cause had built up, and by the evening of May 6th, a raid was green-lit. They kicked the door in. What they found was unsettling. The apartment was cluttered, unwashed clothes, empty pill bottles, stains on the floor. No sign of Jia Mei, but something felt wrong. A sour odor lingered in the air. Something not quite chemical, not quite biological, something in between. Kai Tai was there, calm, too calm. He denied knowing any girl named Jia Mei, claimed the online username wasn't his. He even went as far as biting his own tongue, drawing blood to convince the officers of his innocence. But his story didn't match the data. The call logs, the chat timestamps, the IP address, the bank transfers, the time of the last known sighting of Jia Mei, all of it pointed with unnerving clarity straight to him. Faced with a wall of digital and circumstantial evidence, Kai Tai started to slip. He fumbled his words, repeated phrases, confused dates. He said he hadn't spoken to Jia Mei in over a year, but the record showed a conversation just 10 days earlier. Then came the forensic sweep. Behind a cabinet, officers found a blood-stained bedsheet. In the bathroom, chemical residue. In the kitchen, knives that had been recently sharpened too recently. Still no body, no physical trace of the victim herself. But then detectives searched his browser history. In it, they found a series of visits to an adult forum where Jia Mei had advertised under the name Kimmy. They discovered that Kai Tai had messaged her using an encrypted chat tool. His last message, "Come over. I'll pay double."
It wasn't just suspicion anymore.
They were dealing with a man who had lured a girl to his home, and now she was gone. The pressure began to mount. Interrogators leaned in. The hours dragged on. And finally, under the weight of it all and perhaps the cracks in his own psyche, Kai Tai muttered a sentence no one in the room would forget.
She stopped moving, and I didn't know what to do. He didn't stop there. What he revealed next would leave even seasoned detectives stunned.
At first he mumbled,
She stopped moving.
then a pause. I thought she was asleep. But she wasn't. Under the dim lights of the interrogation room, Kai Tai began to speak. Not with rage or regret, but with a numbness that made officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. As he unraveled his story, it became clear this wasn't just a moment of violence. It was a descent. He told them he had found Jia Mei on a local adult forum. She used the name Kimi. He was drawn in by the photos, youthful, polished, with that soft confidence some teenagers carry when they're pretending not to be scared. She advertised her rate 2,000 yuan a night. He saved the number. On April 17, 2008, 10 days before her disappearance, he messaged her. They agreed to meet. Before that, he spent the night with a friend Yande partying at a nightclub called Golden Dragon. They took ecstasy and inhaled ketamine, a toxic mix for any mind, and Kai Tai's wasn't exactly stable to begin with. He was 27, 5'8", nearly 200 pounds, the owner of a toy shop that never seemed to sell toys, a man with a history of behavioral problems and a mother who had died in a car crash when he was just a teen. Since then, he had spiraled drugs, violence, and a growing detachment from reality. The morning of the meeting, he was still high when he called Jia Mei. She arrived at his apartment just after noon. He remembered she smiled when he handed her cash up front, more than she expected. They went out for lunch, walked back, and entered the dim little flat where the curtains were always drawn. Inside, he offered her drugs. She hesitated, then agreed. They spent the next hour in a haze of smoke and euphoric chemicals. At some point, they became physically intimate. That's when things in his words got blurry.
He claimed that during the act, something snapped. He said he remembered grabbing her too tightly, that she stopped responding, that he panicked, that he didn't know what had happened, only that when he came to, she was still, quiet, cold. For a brief moment, it almost sounded like remorse. But what followed destroyed that illusion.
Instead of calling for help, Kai Tai said he waited. For hours. Just sat there beside her on the bed, staring at the wall. Eventually, he pulled her body into the bathroom, took out a kitchen knife, and began cutting. What makes this part unbearable is how matter-of-factly he described it, as if he was telling a story from someone else's life. He started with her neck. He bled her out to prevent a mess. He separated the limbs, bagged what he could. Internal organs were flushed down the toilet. Flesh was cut small so it wouldn't clog the pipes. And then this is the part that shook even hardened investigators. He told them what he did with the bones. He mixed them with pork. He took the remains and brought them to a butcher shop he had ties to in the Kowloon district, the kind of place where no one asks questions. There, the bones were placed in a pile of pork scraps meant for resale. And yes, some of them were sold. To whom no one knows. That detail perhaps mercifully is lost to time. But forensic teams later confirmed that at least one portion of the victim's remains had in fact ended up in that very meat pile. The horror wasn't just what he did, but how calm he was about it. Investigators asked if he felt anything. He paused. I didn't want anyone to find her, he said. Later, they discovered that after the murder, he had called multiple friends, including Yan Day, and described what he'd done. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. As if trying to make it real by hearing it out loud.
As if daring someone to stop him.
When officers asked if he knew she was dead before dismembering her, he faltered, said he wasn't sure. Medical examiners would later suggest that Jia Mei may have still been alive in a coma-like state when the cutting began. There's no way to confirm it, but some things once spoken cannot be unheard. On May 9, 2008, Kai Tai was formally charged with the murder of Jia Mei. The charge sheet was extensive, not only for unlawful killing, but also for illegal disposal of human remains. The media frenzy was immediate. Headlines across Hong Kong screamed words like butcher monster and market killer, but behind those sensationalized labels was a trial that demanded more than horror. It demanded clarity, procedure, and proof. Prosecutors built their case carefully. The defense, meanwhile, leaned heavily on one argument: diminished capacity. Their claim that Kai Tai had committed the crime under the influence of heavy narcotics, that he had not fully understood what he was doing, that the dismemberment was not a calculated act, but a drug-induced panic. But the facts said otherwise. In court, prosecutors presented digital evidence, browser history, financial transactions, and encrypted chat logs showing his calculated communication with Jia Mei under her alias Kimmy. They showed surveillance footage placing her in the vicinity of his building. Phone data pinpointed her last known location inside his apartment. Then came the physical evidence. Police recovered Jia Mei's skull, found wrapped in plastic near the Kowloon Pier thanks to Kai Tai's own directions. In sewer systems near his building, forensic teams found human tissue remnants. On a discarded CD in his apartment, blood traces that matched Jia Mei's DNA. On kitchen knives, fingerprints his. On the bedsheet stains hers. But perhaps most damning were his own words. During questioning, he confessed, repeatedly, in detail. His defense team tried to walk those statements back, suggesting coercion or confusion. But the recordings played in court told another story. Calm, coherent, cold. Kai Tai sat in silence throughout most of the proceedings, occasionally shifting, never speaking. The court also heard from psychological experts. Some claimed he showed signs of trauma from his youth, citing the death of his mother, his history of drug use, and documented behavioral disorders. But even those experts stopped short of declaring him legally insane. After nearly 3 months of proceedings, on July 29, 2009, the jury deliberated. They returned in just under 3 hours. Guilty. Kai Tai was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. In addition, he received 4 more years for the unlawful handling and disposal of human remains. Hong Kong had abolished the death penalty in 1993, and so even for a crime, this brutal execution was not on the table. Kai Tai appealed twice. Each time he argued that drug intoxication had robbed him of full awareness, that he didn't know what he was doing, that he didn't remember. But the appellate judges weren't moved. They pointed out that after the act, Kai Tai had called friends, describing what he'd done in shocking detail. He hadn't called a lawyer. He hadn't called emergency services. He called friends 3 times. As one judge wrote in the final rejection, his ability to retell his actions shows an awareness that is incompatible with the defense's claims. With that, the appeals were closed. Kai Tai would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for the family of Jia Mei, there was no real justice. No sentence could undo the pain. No verdict could bring her back. Her mother, when approached by the media, declined most interviews, but in one brief statement she said, "I never knew how hard she was trying. I just wanted her to come home." The trial was over, the sentence delivered. But the story of Jia Mei didn't end in a courtroom. It lingered in whispers at dinner tables, in news reports, in the quiet guilt of strangers who once walked past a butcher stall without knowing what they were looking at. It lingered most of all in her mother's eyes. In the days following the conviction, Hong Kong reeled with a very specific kind of horror, not just that a teenage girl had been murdered, but that parts of her may have unknowingly ended up in someone's meal. That detail, unconfirmed but heavily suggested by forensic leads, left many shaken. Wet markets saw a sharp decline in meat sales. News outlets reported long lines at vegetarian vendors. Rumors spread like wildfire. Which shop, which day could it have been my home? But beyond fear, there was something else, grief tangled with shame. Many began questioning how a promising young girl like Jia Mei, once top of her class, ended up in that apartment. Was it greed? Was it rebellion? Or was it something no one wanted to admit? Jia Mei's family lived in government-subsidized housing. Her mother worked collecting scrap. Her sister said she often wondered how Jia Mei could afford designer shoes, modeling classes, and name-brand makeup. They had no idea she was moonlighting under the name Kimi, trying to repay a mysterious 50,000 yuan debt. Some blamed her, said she made choices. Others saw something more tragic, a teenager trying to climb out of poverty, using the only doors society seemed to leave open. Then came another revelation: the modeling school Jia Mei had enrolled in was under investigation for alleged ties to an underage escort ring, a supposed talent agency promising girls fame only to push them toward private jobs in hotel rooms. Jia Mei wasn't the only one. Her death was no longer just a crime, it was a symptom. As one journalist put it, she wasn't lost to a monster, she was lost to a system that preys on the poor while promising them dreams. In the months that followed, community forums and advocacy groups began lobbying for stronger protections for vulnerable youth online. A few arrests were made. The agency in question was quietly shut down, but no one truly answered the question, how many girls are walking that same path right now? As for Kai Tai, he remains in prison, reportedly isolated from other inmates for his own safety. He has refused all media interviews. No family ever came to visit. His father died of illness shortly after his arrest. Alone, he now spends his life in silence behind concrete walls. Yet one question still lingers, the kind that sits in the back of your throat long after the headlines fade. Who bought that meat? Who unknowingly carried home a plastic bag filled with more than just pork bones?
We'll likely never know.
And maybe that's for the best. But for the people of Hong Kong, and for all of us, the story of Jia Mei is more than just a crime. It's a warning about the shadows that live online, about predators who wear masks of opportunity, and about how sometimes the line between survival and destruction is drawn by poverty and indifference. Jia Mei died trying to save her family, and instead she became a symbol of how society can fail its daughters, quietly and completely. And I can't help but wonder, how many other Jia Meis are out there right now, just one yes away from disappearing?